So I'll kind of start with like a little bit of why there seems to be like an agreement, right? If you did a man on the street, if you guys took a microphone and you went out in public and you just did a man on the street and said, "Hello, sir or ma'am, what do you think provoked this feminist movement to start? Like, why do you guys think first wave feminism happened?" And generally what you'll get is, "Oh, well, first wave feminism was good, right? Because it was just equal rights for women. Women were very oppressed. They didn't have any rights. They were practically slaves, chained to a stove in the kitchen, forced to give birth until, they died either in childbirth or of hearth death or something. And they couldn't get divorces, and they just were beaten all the time by drunken husbands. And so the natural, it was just a movement that's time had come and women had to rise up. They looked around and they said, oh no, we are oppressed and we can't stand for this. So we will march and we will go on hunger strikes and we will picket the White House until we get equal rights. And that was a good thing because now all the women have equal rights. And then most people, especially Christians, will kind of say, but I think, maybe it's gone a little far. Maybe these last couple waves were not as good and maybe they took things too far. But I think first wave was good, and it made women into real human beings with rights. Now, that is not the actual history. That's not the truth. But if you're looking at this, watching this podcast going, how did they find this one random lady like in the Midwest who knows the truth about it? And I'm supposed to believe her. Like,
Right.
like all of the universities tell me, and, my history classes and everything in the pop culture, everything I've ever heard tells me one thing. Why should I believe this lady? Well, the reason that I would like you to at least investigate what I'm talking about is because the history was actually gate-kept and kind of stolen
Mm.
starting in 1970 with the advent of women's studies as an academic discipline. Now, this is something that was actually created and paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. And
Shocker.
yeah, I know. If you know anything about that, you'll know that they had their hand in a lot of social engineering, and this is certainly no different. And what happened when they created women's studies as a discipline in universities in 1970 is that they found a particular little group of feminists who were extreme radical Marxists. Sandra Harding was kind of the chief architect of this, along with a couple of other ladies. And she created something called standpoint theory. Now, standpoint theory is the reason why we all have this like common understanding of what we think feminism is and how I can explain that it's not actually true. So, standpoint theory posits that there's no such thing as a historical timeline that's objective. There is no such thing as objective truth or anything like that. It depends on the standpoint of the person examining the history. And in her theory, which comes out of Marxism, and she's very straightforward about that she's a Marxist theorist, very radical one at that, not just like a mainline one, but like a really, really radical Marxist feminist. She says that the most oppressed person, so if we're doing our oppression Olympics and our intersectional, oppression Olympics, it would be something like a person of color who is also, LGBT or something, who is in the lower economic rungs of society. They're going to have the best standpoint from which to examine history because they have the most like levels of oppression going on, and therefore they have more standpoints from which to gauge the history. I know that sounds a little weird and a little convoluted, but it actually became the accepted way of doing empiricism in the historical study of feminism. Wild that nobody ever talks about this. Crazy that we don't really know that this is how they did things. But what that amounts to is that the women's studies departments, they actually have the physical records. So if you're looking for like the Margaret Sanger papers or Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony's papers and a lot of those historical records, they're actually held in the women's studies departments in universities. And these are the places that write the curriculums. These are the places that write the PhD papers and everything that the like historical narrative is based on. And they did that using standpoint theory. So what you're getting is not like what you and I might consider something of an objective timeline of events or anything like that. It is a literal rewrite of the history from the standpoint of an oppressed woman. So it would have been a woman who during, maybe the suffrage era was a suffragette. You would never get, and what we don't get is the standpoint of the women who were against it. Now here's where stuff gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Most people do not know that the vast majority of women around the time of suffrage campaigns were against women's suffrage. They were against women's liberation. They were against feminism.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you
Sure,
give
yeah.
a very, very brief definition of suffrage to our listeners who may not
Yeah.
know what it is?
Yeah, sure. So suffrage just means voting rights. And people also have a misconception that all men always had the right to vote. That since we had any form of democracy or representative republic, that all men immediately got suffrage. They all had the right to vote, which is completely untrue. It was very limited. And the vast majority of men, whether you're talking about England, Australia, the United States, Canada, did not have equal voting rights from the start. There were a lot of restrictions depending on where you were. So like in England, for example, men only got universal suffrage about 10 years before women did, which is something that almost nobody knows.
Wow.
It's there in the historical record. You can look it up and find this information, but that's not what you always hear in the mainstream. Same thing in the United States. It was a gradual process where really most men couldn't vote until after the Civil War. Even then, a lot of, people who didn't own land, or they might have been recent immigrants or things like that, those men couldn't vote either. So really, women's voting rights came along with a lot of other groups getting voting rights. So
Very, very good. So
yeah,
tell us
yeah.
about the other side, the pros, the anti-suffrage. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
so
ones we don't hear about.
this is one of the things I'm trying to do with my work is revive this part of history because there's actually a ton of it there in the record that people don't know about. So they did a couple of referendums early on around the turn of the century to kind of gauge like how interested are women in this, because like most kind of revolutions, this started as a very fringe thing with a very small group of very radicalized women who wanted like no fault divorce and women's voting rights, and they wanted a lot of social change, like a lot of progressive kind of Marxist social change. So they did a few referendums early on in various states to gauge how interested people, and especially women, were in suffrage. So the biggest one we have the most record of was in Massachusetts, and I believe of the women that actually came out to vote in the referendum, only about 4% actually wanted women's suffrage. And because this was so unpopular, there were several other states that had referendums as well that were at least that bad, if not worse. Uh, the women's suffrage associations themselves, so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and their groups, they actually blocked women from voting any further in referendums on whether or not they wanted to vote. Yes, you heard me correctly. The women who wanted women's suffrage didn't want to let women vote on whether or not they wanted suffrage. They were like, we don't care if you want it. We're going to shove it down your throat anyway.
And you can Google that, guys. If you can Google that survey or that referendum results, and it's right. Like Google's not suppressing it. You can find it. And no one knows about it.
And to play devil's advocate, like, do you think some of these feminists would say, well, they didn't want to vote, or
it's Stockholm
suffrage
syndrome?
Were afraid, because their husbands
they were
so
scared of freedom. They had always been slaves, so they were scared of freedom and that sort of thing. Or they were not educated enough and things like that. So what I've kind of done in the last several years is I'm the nerd who does your homework for you. So nobody, even the women's studies like PhD candidates, really don't want to go back and read the writings of feminists from the 19th or 18th centuries because it's long, it's kind of boring, it's archaic language. But I did that for you guys because I love you and I want you to know the truth. So I went back and I went back and read like Susan B. Anthony's History of Woman Suffrage, which is huge. It's like a 4-volume tome that she wrote to detail her own legacy in the women's liberation movement. And right in the first chapter, she says, there's this misconception that women didn't want suffrage because they were uneducated and didn't understand it, or that they were scared of freedom, or things like that. And she said that's really not what my biggest obstacle was. My biggest obstacle was that women were doing so great. They were very happy and they had almost everything they want. In fact, women were very privileged under male suffrage, and they didn't want to lose those privileges. So I had to convince them that the privileges were worth losing for them to have this, equality with men. For instance,
Man up.
I know a lot of people don't know that women actually had higher literacy rates than men did, going back to the very beginning of this country when we started keeping track of that in 1790. Women had higher literacy rates than men. They graduated high school more often than men. They weren't allowed in every field of higher academia, but neither were most men. Most men were not just allowed to, like, it wasn't like now where all you got to do to get into college is knock on the door. It was supposed to be a thing for like the top 5% of people who were very intellectually gifted and going into certain fields, right? So this idea that women were like barred from being educated, completely false. If anything, it's the opposite, because men had to do a lot of farm labor, factory labor, things like that, and it was seen as kind of like a waste to send them to college when they should be laboring and doing trades and things like that. And women, prior to public school, were the educators. So it was seen as very important for women to be literate and have like good knowledge of arts and history and different things. So yeah, Susan B. Anthony herself said, my biggest hurdle was that women were very comfortable. They loved that they had like all this privilege in society, that they
How
had a
would you
lot of rights
define
men didn't have.
how would you define, like, or how does she define this privilege? Because I'm sure these women pushing back and be like, well, what privileges? Like, what?
Right. Right. So, in the book, I have a bunch of the old anti-suffrage like posters printed in there, so you can see them, and I detail some of the arguments there. Some of the privileges, like in New York State, for example, it varies by state, especially because back at this time period, the states ran more like their own countries. We weren't as, federalized as we are now. So, like in New York, for example, if a rich woman came into a marriage with a lot of wealth, say she's marrying like a middle class man, but she comes from an upper class family and she stands to inherit a lot of wealth and property, the man is not entitled to any of her um, resources that she has coming into the marriage, and the men were held completely responsible for the bills, for the debts of the household once they're married. So this is a common thing I'll get, where women say, well, we weren't allowed to have bank accounts and we weren't allowed to have credit cards until the 1960s or 70s. That's true, but do you know why? They never tell you why. The reason why is because it was seen as like a social, it was like there was a social stigma attached to holding women responsible for supporting the family. So they didn't give women credit cards or bank accounts because the man was legally liable for her debt. So say she went to a department store in 1902 and bought a whole new wardrobe that was tailored and everything else, like women often did back then. The man was held responsible for that debt, not the woman. So actually she could often get lines of credit in her husband's name. She could spend, she could own property, she could have wealth coming into the marriage, but no matter what she had, the man was still held responsible. So if for whatever reason that didn't get paid, you couldn't put a woman in debtor's prison and you couldn't hold her legally responsible. It would be the man, even if he, lost his job or came from a poor family, it didn't matter. So
That's crazy.
yeah,
Wow.
there's a lot of things like that that add context that they intentionally wrote out of the history. And there's a great paper that I reference quite often. I think a couple of my Substack pieces reference this. Another history professor named Joe C. Miller, he did a review of women's history texts from the beginning of the 20th century to now. And he found that over time, they actually wrote this stuff out of the history. They removed the fact that there were these anti-suffrage groups that had much higher membership, far more interest and a lot more money and funding than the pro-suffrage groups. They wrote out the fact that there were debates between women who were against suffrage and women who were pro-suffrage, and that the public, sentiment was not so much in favor of women's suffrage because of those debates and things like that. That there were a lot of women actually leading the charge against it, and they had very, very compelling reasons in my view for not wanting suffrage. And maybe we can get into a couple of
So
those.
you're kind of describing something and forgive me because I don't remember the exact term, but it is a ploy that people in power will use where they submit a problem, they create a problem, and then they sell you the solution. I know you know the academic
Yes,
term for that.
that's called the Hegelian dialectic.
Okay, the
You
Hegelian
didn't know
dialect.
that? Come on.
Didn't know it. She went to more school than I did.
I didn't. That's the thing. I just have a high school diploma and a cosmetology license. I'm just nerdy.
You went to the right schools. You went and got your own books and you read them. That's right.
Well, I'm just a curious person and I read a lot. And I was always in like advanced classes, but by the time I got through high school, the thought of going to university, I had such a bad time in public school that I was like, nah, I'm good. And I had my first daughter at 20 and I wanted to be with her. I wanted to stay home with her.
That
So
is awesome. That Prussian education system just isn't cut out
right.
for everybody, is it?
That's right. Everybody
gotta
has to go
educate
get this book here. School World Order by John Klizek tells you all about the founding of that Prussian public school system and who came up with it and why.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah,
that Hegelian, so basically we're understanding that here we have a ploy. We have this mechanism people have used many, many times, because you said just a minute ago that they didn't have all the power. They didn't have all the support. They didn't even have all the money. And yet somehow they overcame. And so that's the question is how, and how did they actually get the minds of women when they weren't really supported? It's wild.
Yeah, that's the good question, right? Like, this lady's telling me that the history isn't what I've been told. So how did we end up here? If nobody wanted this, how did we get it, right? Well, we're talking about the era that suffrage is being debated is the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, right around this Victorian era, when we're coming out of the Industrial Revolution and we've got the first big like titans of industry, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, these nouveau riche families of the golden age that were some of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world. And we'd never really seen this before, because you'd never had like a democratic republic with these like titans of industry making incredible money for the time period and having like incredible influence over politics and being able to kind of buy off some senators and congressmen. And then they start their philanthropic foundations because they're doing philanthropy, because they love you and they just want a nice society for you to live in. So they start these mega, multi-million-dollar philanthropy foundations that became the social engineering hubs of the 20th century and completely molded the society that we live in now. So what happened is suffrage was very unpopular. But coming out of the Civil War, a lot of the feminist activists kind of hitched their wagon to people who were anti-slavery or, trying to liberate slaves and things like that. They kind of tried to like attach themselves to that movement, which a lot of those people didn't like. They were like, oh, it's kind of a separate thing, ladies. Like it's not really the same. But they kind of succeeded in doing that to a point. And in the book, I have a whole chapter on this, on how the Gilded Age millionaires kind of, why they wanted feminism, why they liked it, why they picked up on a few of these people and kind of pushed them to the forefront and kind of funded the whole thing. Right. So I don't know if you want me to get into that.
Definitely.
A little bit.
How did the dollar bills play into this sucker? I think that's great.
So,
let's get into that. That's ultimately the way it is, right? Dollar
bill. Probably the main character in the play of how this happened is a woman. Her name is Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. Sorry, it's a mouthful. And if you're wondering why she has so many last names, it's because she was the first woman to successfully marry money and then get divorced like multiple times and walk away with a lot of the money from her ex-husband. So she first married Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandson, he was a notorious philanderer and was off, like rich men often do, off, in Europe having affairs and things like that. And so she was able to attain a divorce at a time when that was pretty rare and pretty hard to do, and got half of his fortune. After that, she married his best friend, who she was presumably already having an affair with before the divorce, because it happened really quickly. His name was Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. And the Belmont family were the bankers they were like bankers for the Rothschilds. So very prestigious, very wealthy, very influential family there. And then he died shortly after the wedding. So she was one of the most wealthy women on planet Earth at the time. She ended up with this huge, and like the amount of estates, like these Gilded Age mansions that you see, she owned many of those, and she had all this money. And so now that she's in her twilight years and she's single and she's got all this money, she really fell in with the suffrage crowd and really liked what they were doing. And she almost single-handedly really got it going. There were other actors who did, and I cover that in the book, but she's like the main person, because what she would do is, a lot of these feminist activists were terrorists. They would bomb places, they would light fires, they would do various acts of terrorism, they would break storefront windows, things like that. Especially like the Pankhurst family in England, you'll read a lot about them doing terrorist activity to try to force the issue of suffrage. So she would bail them out. Anytime they got arrested for doing these kind of terrorist activities, she'd bail them out of jail. She bought them their headquarters. She funded the publication of a bunch of different magazines and pamphlets that they would circulate everywhere. Basically propaganda, right? Propaganda machine that she funded. And then Cornelius Vanderbilt also, he was involved with the Woodhull sisters, who were abolitionists and first wave suffragists. Also, snake oil salesmen, con artists, and total like gangster women, basically. They were wanted in several states for selling fake cancer cures. They conned people out of money all the time by being spirit mediums and fortune tellers and tarot card readers. And what they did was they helped Cornelius Vanderbilt game the stock market during its first crash in the late 1800s. He came out on top. Everybody else lost their behind, and he came out on top to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And the press asked him, they said, I think they could kind of tell something was up. They were like, how did you have such foresight to know exactly what to sell and when to sell it to make all this money? It's really interesting that you're the only person that came out of it like this. And he said to the papers, do as I do, consult the spirits. Yeah. So he said these women told his fortune, but what really happened is they had their own prostitution ring that they ran. Yeah. Lovely ladies. They ran a prostitution ring in New York where they had spies who were sleeping with a lot of the high-level Wall Street guys, and they got insider trading tips and gave it to him. So he, in turn for their help with the espionage, funded their first women's magazine, which was the first publication to publish the Communist Manifesto in the United States.
Wow.
So you can see when I tell you this side of the history why the women's studies departments in the 70s didn't want to teach this to the nice suburban girls whose parents were paying for them to be educated at these nice universities, right? They didn't want to say, oh yeah, the heroes of our movement are con artists and they sell fake cancer cures and they do insider trading and they're communists and they're fortune
back then
tellers.
Communist was like a very bad word.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially, we're coming out of the Red Scare in World War II. Mm-hmm. Nobody wanted that association. So they were very cryptic about that part of the history and never really told it. So when you hear these women spoken about in the mainstream, they're always just talked about like they're heroes, like they're these wonderful heroes. And they're often portrayed as Christian, which is the thing that I wanted Christian women to know, because most of these women not only weren't Christian, despite whatever labels they wanted to use, but they often made a living as automatic writers. So they would claim that like spirits came to them and told them to write this book or this speech or this, whatever they wrote. Or they would be spirit mediums, fortune tellers, tarot card readers, all that kind of stuff. They were involved in like theosophy and various forms of occult magic and things like that. There's a a professor I reference in my book from Sweden, who himself is a Luciferian, and he wrote his PhD thesis, which is a book you can buy on Amazon. It's called Satanic Feminism, and he details this same history, and indeed says what I say, which is that these women in the suffrage era that were at the forefront of the movement, they openly declared Lucifer as their liberator.
That's
So
fascinating.
yeah, one of the
Yeah,
most mind-blowing things would probably be if everybody knew about the Woman's Bible. We'll have to talk about the Woman's
yeah.
Bible.
Can we? I want to wrap that up because
Yeah,
there's 2
sure.
points you said before we go into the, because that's Joe and I's most interesting part is what we're kind of
Yeah.
going into now, which is the occult connections. I find that just absolutely awesome. But to wrap up the desire for these high rolling guys, they're kind of taking these black sheep women, right? And
Yes.
they're influencing the culture that way to the point so that they can open up a giant workflow from all these women, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that what they want to do? So they want
Yes.
to liberate the women, and then all these women are now available for the workplace, and then the men no longer can, what you said, household income, or what did you call it, family income. They no longer,
Yeah.
janitor can't make a family now, because you have all these women in here. And so that was the as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the goal in achieving
Yes.
women's liberation. Like Joe said, the dollars, how do they make the dollars? By limiting the effective the value of a man in the workplace has now been chopped in half.
Yeah, yeah.
So they make more
I'm
money now.
glad you brought me back to that. Thank you for doing that, because yes, at this time, so in Russia they had the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And one of the very first things that the Bolshevik government did, they appointed a woman, a feminist. Her name was Alexandra Kollontai, and they made her one of the highest ranking cabinet members in their government. She was the commissar for social welfare, and she said, we need to completely get rid of the family unit. It's archaic, it's old fashioned. And the reason they wanted to get rid of it specifically as Marxist revolutionaries was the everything is passed down through the father. We got to get rid of this idea of the father and the nuclear family, because private property is passed down through the father, the man being the breadwinner and the purchaser of land, and the person who leaves a legacy to his children. If we can get rid of that, we can take all of the, property and wealth and resources and put it in the hands of the state. So we've got to get rid of this patriarchy, which the word patriarchy simply means nothing more than rule by the father. That's all it means. It means that the father is the head of the home and of the nation and of the church. And she said, the first thing we got to do is get rid of that. We need women to see themselves as units of labor, and not as mothers of their own children. Yes, you should produce new human beings to be new units of labor for the state, but those children don't belong to you. They should be raised communally by the state for the purpose of serving the state. So what the Bolsheviks did, they replaced God. Russia was an Orthodox Christian nation at the time. They made it illegal. They repossessed all the churches by force using violence, and made atheism and worship of the state the religion. So when this is going on in 1917, the Communist International, a lot of the really influential Europeans in Germany, France, and England wanted to bring all of that here. And these wealthy industrialists were all in these circles with these intellectuals. And they thought this was a really good idea for all these huge factories that are just being built. We need lots of cheap labor. We need a much bigger labor pool, and they couldn't import enough people through immigration. It's actually a problem we're dealing with right now. So they said, what we need to do is get women out of the home and into the workforce. And if we do that, not only these are the same people, okay, the same people that funded suffrage were the same small group of people that were at the Jekyll Island Club in 1913 who created the legislation that created the Federal Reserve banking system and the income tax. So those people said, well, now we've got this income tax, we've got this Federal Reserve banking system. If we can get women out of the home and into the workforce, we can tax not one, but two incomes. And we will have not only one person that we can get into debt, but we'll have two people we can get into debt. And there was a third benefit there, which is if both parents are working all day, what do we do with the children?
Right.
So around the exact same time, they create the compulsory public education system. So all the children go off to school during the day where the government can indoctrinate them. And of course, these private foundations that we're talking about also created public school curriculum, helped fund the Department of Education. So it was basically a giant social engineering project to break up the nuclear family and make everybody do everything they do day to day on behalf of the state and corporations.
And the sick part is it all comes off as them doing favors for each other, for the people. That's the
Yes.
sickest part. Is it's like
Yeah,
we're
we're
doing you a
supposed to
favor.
believe they just care. They just really want
Yeah.
women to be able to vote. We just think women should be able to have political opinions. We
Isn't
we
that
care
every
so
political?
much about
Yeah.
women's political opinions,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
Is that
Sure.
was a lot of this like it seems like the feminist movement kind of is a worldwide thing around the same time. Did Europe go through this kind of at the same time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first book covers kind of the history of the West. So England, Canada, United States, and Australia all kind of followed the same timeline, and all of those feminists were talking to each other. They met with each other, they had letters back and forth, they did speeches, events, they had, all kinds of conventions and things like that together. There was a little bit of a separate thing going on in the East, which my next book is about, and it's taken 2 years of research, and it's a behemoth. It's really big because there's actually a lot to this as well. So that woman I was just telling you about in Russia, Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, all kind of along the same timeline, but in a very different way, funded by the same people. So if you guys don't know, the Bolshevik Revolution was actually mostly funded by Wall Street banks, which sounds weird, right? It sounds like, why would capitalist bankers want a communist state? Well, it's because we're talking about that Hegelian dialectic again. They don't care how they get to their end goal, whether it's capitalism, communism, a fusion of the two, whatever it is. They kind of had the same goals, and they just knew that the social engineering seemed to be, they kind of backed several players in the USSR, and the Bolsheviks came out on top. So they went with that. They tried Marxism. We all kind of know how that went, but yeah, it was basically the same kind of people just trying a different method of getting the same result there. They tried the liberal version of it here and the more Marxist version of it there, which then later in the mid 20th century they kind of used various propaganda machines to kind of try to fuse the two. So it gets a little complicated, and that's why this book is taking a long time, but I think it's super important. So I'll be
Because as
very excited
Americans,
when
like
it's done.
especially in the dating community, there's these guys who be like, "Oh, get a Russian bride," or some lady out of a third world country that still has some of these fundamental ideas of patriarchy, what have you.
Right.
So that is fascinating.